All right, guys. Hello. Welcome to week 8 of the semester. Hope you're all doing well. I thought I'd record a mini lecture for you because it's been a couple weeks in doing that. This week's theme is Western imperialism, which is a pretty broad topic, but I thought this video would help you get a grasp on the basics of it, especially before the quiz this week and going into the exam, which we'll have before too long. So, talking about imperialism today, imperialism by definition is essentially territories that are controlled by a foreign nation. This has been happening since the beginnings of human civilization. The earliest empires were formed in, 2 to 3,000 BC. So this is nothing new. But in the period that we're looking at here in Western Civ 2, the period of the modern age, there begins what's called the new imperialism. This is what historians call it. The new imperialism was basically a collection of Western countries, and we can also include Japan in this group as well, dominating most of the rest of the world. From about 1870, we could probably go sooner than that, to the late 1940s when these empires start falling apart. And this is the new imperialism because not only is this kind of a small group of countries doing this, but it's new innovations in things like technology, where new weapons and forms of transportation and communication get deployed to dominate the rest of the world. New forms of economic expansion and economic imperialism, namely capitalism, kind of consuming the markets of the rest of the world. And finally, this new turn in Western culture where being of the West means you're automatically superior to any native person you might come across in Asia or Africa or wherever that you're trying to conquer. Some of the tools that are, I'm going to break this down and kind of look at these in slightly more detail. Some of the technology that's employed are referred to as the tools of civilization, of true civilization. And this includes advanced weaponry, like artillery pieces that can shoot, miles away. New innovation in gunpowder, including rapid fire guns, such as the Gatling gun or the machine gun, I suppose would be a good catch-all. And these weapons are deployed in colonial ventures, such as the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which is depicted in this really old classic film called Zulu, where, Michael Caine is still around. He's still acting. Of course, I say that, and it's 2020, and I say that, and he's probably going to die today now that I said that, but God, I hope not. Anyway, but a young Michael Caine, leads this group of British soldiers in South Africa against the native Zulus, and 150 British officers with advanced weaponry are able to take on several thousand native Zulu warriors. And it's emblematic of the effectiveness that these new Western weapons can do on the battlefield, and in upholding. You only need a few guys with a machine gun, and you're able to hold a bunch of territory in Africa. It's a very lopsided struggle whenever these things do come down to war and conquest. Steamships and railroads help abundantly in being able to move troops and goods and supplies throughout the various empires. So here's a map of India, where India is crisscrossed by railroads under British domain, and this helps the British maintain control over the Indian subcontinent, which previously that would not have been possible. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 is huge. That basically cuts the amount of time. Like, instead of having to go around Africa, you can now just cut through the Suez Canal, cut through Egypt, and save your time on your way from the west to the east. Saves a lot of miles, thousands of miles of travel throughout your trip. The Panama Canal is finished in 1914. It's under American domain, and that allows us to cut through Central America instead of, having to go around the Cape of South America. So it's the result of these advances in technology, whether it's weapons or communication or travel, decrease costs of being able to build and maintain an empire. Also, travel time gets cut for things like goods and the military. The economic side of imperialism is centered around resource extraction. So, moving into a place, let's say, Central Africa, where they have rubber trees. This is where rubber is grown, is in the jungles of the Congo. So Belgium moves in there, they conquer the area, and they begin cutting down all of the rubber trees and exporting that rubber back to the West for use in our Goodyear tires and Firestone tires and stuff like that. So it's extracting resource, sending resources back to the motherland. This, of course, leads to the destruction of indigenous industries. Basically, rapacious capitalism does not care at all how many people it's throwing out of work in the places that it's moving into. The bottom line is all that matters, and getting the cheapest goods for the people that quote unquote deserve them in the West. That is the mission. We don't care about indigenous ways of life being destroyed. Cultural imperialism is very much a part of this new imperialism as well. This includes Christian missionaries penetrating into the central parts of Africa, fanning out throughout Asia, essentially trying to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to the parts of the world that are not aware of it. And missionaries are oftentimes keen to spread Christianity, whether they are welcome there or not. They certainly do find lots of willing adherents and new souls, to bring to the harvest, so to speak. But there's also a lot of resistance to evangelical Christianity in this way, or missional Christianity, because people already have religious traditions. Why would we give this up for this new thing that we've never heard of, that is a very Western contraption by this point? There's also this belief in the civilizing mission, this sense that, and this is one of your documents that you'll read for this week, is the poem called "The White Man's Burden." But this becomes a catchphrase during this age of new imperialism, that it's the white man's burden to lift up the poor, wretched, backward races of the world. Those people who are not fortunate enough to be born in the West, into Western white Christianity. We need to go throughout the world and we need to help these people because they're a bunch of backward dum-dums. This is the civilizing mission. And when you read The White Man's Burden, this Rudyard Kipling poem later in the week, it will be made clear as to what this entails. But this goes into different advertisements. People are selling things like soap. This Pears soap advertisement, it's the white man's burden to teach the virtues of cleanliness and to perhaps make the darker races of the world more white by this soap that we're selling. It's the white man's burden to lift up the depraved others that they see. That's the perspective that's being pushed here in the cultural imperialistic mindset of the new imperialism. So to break down what this means and how much territory some of these empires end up taking, we're seeing the divvying up of the world by about 6 or 7 different countries, which is pretty insane. The largest is the British Empire. It's one of the oldest existing empires by this point. It's the largest, both in territory and population. It's said that the sun never sets on the British Empire because whenever it's daytime, there's some kind of territory on Earth under the thrall of Britain. The sun literally never sets. It's a global empire. The white settlement colonies make up the biggest territories. Look at Canada. Canada is the second largest polity by land mass next to Russia, and it belongs to Britain at this time. So does Australia, which is an entire continent by itself. The subcontinent of India and its neighbors, and then there's also this chain of territories that strings north to south in Africa, from Egypt all the way to South Africa. It's insane how big the British Empire is. And it really sets the pace for other countries that want to be as ambitious as they are. Other colonies, besides the white settler colonies, India, Malaysia, Egypt, Rhodesia, most of the Caribbean. There's a ton of others I'm not going to get into, but it's enormous. It's the biggest. France has a rather large empire as well, even though it's mostly made out of sand. North Africa, so Algeria, Libya, Morocco, some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and Saharan Africa. There's just a lot. There's not a lot of value there in terms of resources and population, but France nevertheless lays claim to large chunks of Africa. There's also parts of East Africa, the large island of Madagascar off the East African coast, and then also what's known as Indochina at the time. What's today Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos is controlled by France. By the time America gets involved in the Vietnam War in the 1960s, it's kind of to help rescue France. France withdrew from those territories, and America comes in to kind of bail out France because they used to own the place. That's part of it. That's actually it's way more complicated than that in terms of Cold War politics. But France used to own Vietnam. There's also Germany. So Germany is a new country. By the time we get to the age of imperialism, Germany has recently unified in 1871. And I wish I could go into more detail. It's a very cool story, how Germany becomes its own country. But we just don't have the time to talk about it this semester. But Prussia, which is the largest German state, goes to war with a bunch of its neighbors, Denmark, Austria, and France. And kicking the fannies of all their neighbors, they prove to the rest of Germany that they should unify and become the strong Central European German country. And they form an empire. It's called the German Empire because it stretches pretty far across Central and Eastern Europe. But they're initially Germany's not super into obtaining overseas colonies, mostly because the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. Britain and France have taken some of the best parts of the world. And Germany's like, we don't really want to do this and pick up the scraps. But under public pressure from the German people and a few intellectuals and politicians, it's like, no, we got to keep up with the Joneses, man. We gotta build an overseas empire, or we're going to fall behind the rest of the West. Got to keep up with the Joneses in the empire business. So they do. Germany takes parts of East Africa and South Africa. And there's Cameroon. There's not a whole lot to say about this. It's not very successful. Italy is another recently unified country in Europe. They unified as a country in 1861. Again, I wish I had more time to talk about how this happened, but it did. They dreamed of rebuilding the Roman Empire, which is hilarious because it's just not going to happen. And they settle for taking parts of North Africa, and also they go to war with Ethiopia, which was the last remaining free country in Africa. But they underestimated the resourcefulness of the Ethiopian people. Ethiopia was and is a very modern country. And they have guns, they have Christianity, they're basically equipped to rely upon themselves in resistance to imperial powers, and they lose. The Italians actually lose their first invasion of Ethiopia. They lose that war, so they're super embarrassed because they can't even take Ethiopia. They can't even fight Africans. How in the world are they going to unite the Roman Empire if they can't defeat these according to them, these lowly Africans. And of course, it remains, it's bearing worth repeating that Ethiopians were not these helpless creatures by any stretch. They kicked the asses of the Italians pretty well. So the one thing I'm going to hover on a little bit, because we have not talked about America a whole lot in this class. Not since the first week or two. Europe's not the only place building empires. Indeed, the United States is on its own mission to build its own transcontinental North American empire. And this is seen through the idea of manifest destiny, which was hugely popular in the 1800s. The manifest destiny was this belief that Americans held that we should own the entire North American continent from coast to coast. Okay, maybe not all of North America, but the United States certainly should stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This is the destiny of America to do this. And here's this famous painting called Manifest Destiny. It's this, the United States is symbolized by these cowboys and pioneers and wagon people and trains and telegraphs, and also this kind of angel person who's spreading the light of civilization from the Atlantic seaboard to the darker places of North America, the places owned by the Native Americans in the West. It's a very racist idea, because it's this idea that white Americans owe themselves, is their destiny to control the land that Native Americans claim and have claimed for thousands of years. So effectively pushing Native people off their land in favor of white Christian settlers, that's manifest destiny. The U.S. government is very much backing the movement of pioneers and settlers from the Atlantic states and the Midwest across the Rockies and into the West, and occupying all the land between the seas. Part of the empire building project, it should be mentioned, is inclusive of the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. We went to war with Mexico, and America effectively stole half of Mexican territory at the time, like the modern states of California, Arizona, New Mexico. These were all places that Mexico had domain over for quite some time. These are states or territories that eventually become states that are added to the Union. But it's all as a result of a very lopsided war with Mexico. There's also another lopsided war with Spain, which helps America start to acquire its first overseas colonies later on in the 1800s. So there's this peaceful acquisition of Alaska from Russia in 1867. But there was also the overthrow of the Hawaiian Queen. In 1893, Hawaii becomes a dependent territory of the United States government, eventually becomes a state later on. But the war, the main thing I want to mention here is the Spanish-American War in 1898. This was a war that was fabricated by journalists to kind of push the United States towards war. And the Americans end up winning a very lopsided conflict against a broke and impoverished Spanish crown. And some commentary there by my wife, where the United States conquers what's left of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire has been disintegrating for quite some time, since I don't know, a hundred years or so after Columbus. But Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico all become American territories. America grants independence to Cuba, but keeps the rest. So we eventually get a map. This is a very rudimentary map. I apologize. This is the American Empire as it stood towards the end of the 1800s. So Hawaii, Alaska acquired, Puerto Rico, Cuba, lots of islands throughout the Pacific Ocean, the largest chain being the Philippines. The Philippines were an American possession until after World War II. So America did in fact have an empire. As much as we liked to deny it at the time, we're like, yeah, we're not really an empire. We believe in freedom and independence and sovereignty. And, we declared independence from an empire long ago to start our own country. We don't believe in empires, but in reality, America is well on its way to building an overseas empire by the time we get to World War I. All right. Lastly, the Japanese Empire should not be ignored because the Japanese, even though they're not included in the West, quote unquote, when it comes to Western style imperialism, the Japanese are absolutely a part of it. Japan gets super embarrassed in the 1800s when Japan for quite a while has been kind of shut off from the rest of the world, but it was forced to modernize by America. Actually, America's like the United States sailed a fleet over to Japan, pointed their guns at Japanese ports, and said, "You guys either trade with us, or we're gonna, blast all of your coastal cities." Japanese, who had no modern weaponry, were like, "Okay." And so, under threat of basically extortion and being threatened by the West, Japan is forced to modernize, and it does so very, very quickly. It acquires Western-style weaponry, military tactics, technology, and it starts building an empire of its own because it realizes it will not, or it believes anyway, it will not survive in the modern world unless they become strong enough to stand up toe-to-toe with Western empires. So, with new ships, steamships, artillery, machine guns, the Japanese military modernizes incredibly quickly, makes up for hundreds of years of lost time, revolutionizes their samurai class, and starts conquering territories around East Asia like Korea. They invade China on multiple occasions and take big chunks of Chinese territory, the biggest of which is Manchuria. They also acquire a bunch of islands in the South Pacific, and Japan is well on its way to building an empire that is worthy of being included in this new Western-style imperialism. In fact, when World War I comes in 1914, Japan is on the side of the Western Allies. Like, they're allies with the United States, with Great Britain, with France, in the struggle against the Central Powers. But, and it's a long story to overgeneralize here, the Western powers, even though Japan helps them quite a bit in this war, particularly against the Empire of Germany, Westerners refuse to give Japan equal treatment. There are a bunch of lopsided treaties that are signed with Japan that allow Westerners to do terrible things to Japanese people. They do not view Japan as an equal because of different racist and cultural tropes. And this angers Japan, and this is partly why Japan will turn on the West and ally themselves with the Axis powers in World War II. But that's all, a couple weeks away yet. All right, guys. Thank you. If you made it all the way through this, you're a more enlightened person, and you'll be in good stead for the quiz this week. I hope you're all doing well. Congratulations to making it halfway through the semester. And let me know if you have any questions about anything. Have a great week, guys. Bye.